Al Pacino met a real Cuban drug lord to prepare for Scarface. The meeting was arranged in secret, in Miami, in 1983. Al spent 3 hours in this man's house, watching, listening, learning. What he saw that night terrified him so much that he later said Tony Montana was innocent compared to the real thing. This is the story of the most dangerous research any actor has ever done. It was early 1983, and Al Pacino had a problem. He'd just signed on to play Tony Montana in Brian De Palma's Scarface, a remake of the 1932 gangster classic but set in the world of Miami cocaine trafficking. The script was written by Oliver Stone, himself a controversial figure who'd lived wild years and knew something about excess and violence. The character Tony Montana was a Cuban refugee who arrives in Miami during the Mariel boatlift and claws his way to the top of the cocaine empire through ruthless violence and ambition. It was a huge role, a career-defining role, and Al knew it. But he also knew he had no idea how to play it. Al Pacino was 43 years old in 1983 and already a legend. He'd done the Godfather trilogy, Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, and a string of performances that had established him as one of the greatest actors of his generation. But all of those roles had been grounded in worlds he understood or could research through conventional means. Cops, mobsters, bank robbers, these were American archetypes he could study through observation, through talking to people, through reading. But Tony Montana was different. Tony was a Cuban immigrant operating in the cocaine underworld of early 1980s Miami, a world that was genuinely dangerous, actively criminal, and completely closed off to outsiders. You couldn't just walk into that world and take notes. People didn't talk to journalists or actors doing research. They killed people who asked too many questions. And Al Pacino was a method actor. He didn't just memorize lines and hit marks. He inhabited his characters. He needed to understand them from the inside, to know how they thought, how they moved, what motivated them, what scared them. For The Godfather, he'd spent time with Italian-American families, learning their mannerisms and speech patterns. For Serpico, he'd ridden along with real New York cops, watching how they worked. For Dog Day Afternoon, he'd studied the real bank robber the story was based on. That was AL's process. Research. Immersion. Transformation. But how do you research a Cuban cocaine trafficker without getting killed? That was the question Al posed to his team in early 1983. He had researchers, dialect coaches, and advisors who helped him prepare for roles. He told them he needed to meet someone real, someone who actually lived in that world. Not an actor's approximation, not a consultant who used to be involved years ago. He needed to sit across from someone who was currently in the life, who could show him what Tony Montana would really be like. His team told him it was impossible. Too dangerous. Even if they could arrange such a meeting, the risk was enormous. These weren't actors or retired gangsters looking for attention. These were active criminals who had every reason to distrust outsiders and who solved problems with violence. Al didn't care. He insisted. If he was going to play Tony Montana, he needed to understand Tony Montana. And that meant meeting the real thing. Through connections that have never been fully disclosed, AL's team made contact with someone in Miami's Cuban exile community who had ties to the cocaine trade. The exact identity of this person has never been revealed publicly, and Al has been deliberately vague about the details over the years, likely to protect the people who arranged the meeting and possibly to protect himself. What is known is that in the spring of 1983, a meeting was arranged. Al would fly to Miami and spend an evening with a real Cuban drug trafficker, someone who was actively involved in the cocaine business at the highest levels. The meeting would take place in the man's home. There would be no recordings, no notes, no witnesses beyond whoever the trafficker chose to have present. Al would come alone, unarmed, and completely at this man's mercy. When AL's agent heard about the plan, he was horrified. He told Al he was risking his life for a role, that no performance was worth getting killed over. AL's response was simple. If he couldn't do the research properly, he wouldn't do the role at all. That was his standard. Total commitment or nothing. So the meeting was set. Total commitment or nothing. So the meeting was set. Al flew to Miami on a commercial flight, traveling under a false name to avoid attention. He was picked up at the airport by someone he'd never met before, driven through parts of Miami he didn't recognize, and eventually brought to a house in a neighborhood that looked completely ordinary from the outside. Middle class, quiet, the kind of place where families lived and kids played in the yards. Nothing about it suggested that one of Miami's major cocaine distributors lived there. That was the point. The man Al was about to meet had survived in an incredibly dangerous business by not looking the part. Al was brought into the house through a side entrance. The interior was surprisingly tasteful. Expensive furniture, but not ostentatious. Art on the walls. Everything clean and well maintained. This wasn't the gaudy mansion that Tony Montana would eventually inhabit in the movie. This was the home of a businessman, which is exactly how this man saw himself. The drug lord, whose name Al has never revealed, was in his late 40s, well-dressed in casual expensive clothes, and spoke perfect English with only a slight Cuban accent. He was polite, even charming. He offered Al a drink, asked if he was comfortable, made small talk about the weather and the flight. For the first few minutes, Al later recalled, it felt like a normal social visit. But then the conversation shifted. The man asked Al why he wanted to do this movie, why he wanted to play a Cuban drug dealer. Was it just for the money? For the fame? Al explained his process, how he needed to understand the people he portrayed, how he couldn't play someone authentically without knowing how they really lived and thought. The man listened carefully, studying Al's face as he spoke. Then he smiled and said something that Al never forgot. He said, "You want to know what it's really like? Okay. But when you leave here tonight, you're going to wish you hadn't asked." What followed was 3 hours that Al Pacino has described in various interviews over the years as one of the most intense and frightening experiences of his life. The drug lord talked. He talked about his life in Cuba before the revolution, his escape to America during Mariel, his early years in Miami working menial jobs while watching other Cubans getting rich in the cocaine trade. He talked about his decision to get involved, the first deals he made, the first time he saw serious violence. He talked about the structure of the business, how the cocaine moved from Colombia to Miami, how it was distributed, how money was laundered, how territories were divided, how disputes were settled. And he talked about violence. Not in the way someone recounts a story they heard, but with the casual familiarity of someone discussing their actual job. He described murders he'd ordered. Not in vague terms, but in specific detail. The reasons, the methods, the aftermath. He talked about the first man he'd killed personally, how it had felt, how it had changed him. He described torture, not as something from movies but as a business tool, a way to extract information or send messages. He talked about betrayals, about friends he'd killed or had killed, about the constant paranoia that came with the life. Al sat there, barely speaking, just listening and watching. The man wasn't bragging, wasn't trying to shock or impress him. He was simply explaining his world, answering the question Al had come to ask. This is what it's really like. This is who these people really are. At one point, the man showed Al scars from a knife fight. At another point, he showed him a gun he kept in a drawer in the living room, one of several weapons stashed around the house. He explained that he never felt safe, even in his own home, even surrounded by security. Trust no one. Assume everyone is either a threat or potential leverage. Those were the rules of survival. The man talked about money, the enormous amounts of cash that flowed through the business, more money than Al could imagine. But he also talked about how that money couldn't buy the things that really mattered. He couldn't trust anyone. He couldn't have real friendships. His family lived in constant danger. His children were targets. Every relationship in his life was transactional or tactical. He lived in a beautiful house but felt like a prisoner in it. He had more money than he could spend but couldn't enjoy any of it because he was always looking over his shoulder. And he talked about the inevitability of it all. He knew how it would end. Prison or death. Those were the only two ways out of the life. Nobody retired from this business. Nobody walked away. You either got caught or you got killed. It was just a matter of time. He'd accepted that. He was just trying to delay it as long as possible and take care of his family before the end came. Toward the end of the 3 hours, the man asked Al a question. He said, "So now that you know what this life is really like, are you still going to make your movie? Are you still going to play this character?" Al didn't know how to answer. He sat there in silence for a long moment. The man laughed, not cruelly but with genuine amusement. He said, "You're going to do it anyway, aren't you? Because it's just a movie. It's not real. You get to play the part without actually living it. You get to pretend to be me without the consequences. That must be nice." Al tried to explain that the movie wasn't glorifying the life, that it was actually a tragedy, showing the downfall and destruction that comes from that world. The man shook his head. He said, "It doesn't matter what you intend. People will watch it and see the power, the money, the respect. They'll see Tony Montana as someone to admire, someone to emulate. They won't see the reality. They'll see the fantasy." As Al was preparing to leave, the man gave him one final piece of advice. He said, "When you play this character, remember something. The real Tony Montanas of the world don't win. They don't get redemption. They don't get to learn from their mistakes and become better people. They just destroy everything around them until someone destroys them. If you want to play it honestly, show that." Al was driven back to his hotel. He didn't sleep that night. He kept replaying the conversation in his mind, the casual way the man had described horrors, the dead look in his eyes when he talked about the future he knew was coming. The meeting had given Al exactly what he'd asked for. He now understood who Tony Montana really was. But he also understood something darker. He understood the emptiness at the core of that life, the spiritual death that comes from living without trust or love or hope. When filming began on Scarface, Al brought everything he'd learned from that meeting into the performance. The bravado, the paranoia, the explosive violence, but also the underlying emptiness. If you watch the film carefully, especially in the later scenes, you can see it. Tony Montana surrounds himself with wealth and power, but he's completely alone. He trusts no one. He destroys every relationship he has. He sits in his mansion with a mountain of cocaine and an arsenal of weapons, and he's the most isolated person in the world. That wasn't in the script. That was Al understanding the real man he'd met in Miami. In interviews years later, Al has been asked multiple times about his research for Scarface. He's always been vague about the specifics of that meeting, never naming names or giving details that could identify anyone. But he's consistently said that meeting changed him as an actor and as a person. He's said that he saw true evil that night, not the cartoonish villainy of movies but the banal, business-like evil of someone who had normalized horror. And he's said something else that's revealing. He said that after that meeting, he understood why some roles shouldn't be played, why some research shouldn't be done. Not because of physical danger, though that was real enough, but because of what you bring back with you. When you stare into that abyss, when you really understand the darkest parts of human nature, you can't unknow it. It stays with you. The man Al met that night in Miami, whoever he was, eventually met the end he predicted. Al has never confirmed this publicly, but people close to the production have suggested that the man was killed in the mid-1980s during the Miami drug wars, gunned down in a dispute over territory or money or betrayal. Just like he said would happen. Just like it always happens. When Scarface was released in 1983, it was controversial and polarizing. Critics were divided. Some called it a masterpiece, others called it excessive and irresponsible. The Cuban community in Miami protested, saying it perpetuated negative stereotypes. The MPAA initially gave it an X rating for violence, and De Palma had to cut scenes to get it down to an R. The movie was not a massive commercial success initially, though it eventually became a cult classic and one of the most quoted and referenced films in hip-hop culture. But for Al Pacino, Scarface was something different. It was the role where he most directly confronted real evil and tried to portray it honestly. And it was the role that taught him the limits of method acting. You can research. You can prepare. You can immerse yourself. But some things are too dark to fully inhabit without losing part of yourself. In 2014, Al did a rare extended interview about Scarface for the film's anniversary. He was asked if he regretted that meeting in Miami, if he wished he'd prepared for the role differently. Al thought for a long moment before answering. He said, "I don't regret it. It made the performance what it was. But I would never do it again. Some doors, once you open them, you can't close. And some things you learn, you can't unlearn." That meeting in Miami in 1983 gave us one of cinema's most iconic performances. But it also showed the price of that kind of commitment, that kind of truth-seeking. Al Pacino wanted to know what a real drug lord was like. He found out. And what he found out haunted him for years. The real Scarface wasn't glamorous. He wasn't powerful in any meaningful way. He was trapped in a life he couldn't escape, waiting for the inevitable violent end, surrounded by wealth he couldn't enjoy and people he couldn't trust. That's what Al saw. That's what he brought to the screen. That's what makes Tony Montana feel so authentic and so tragic. Because Al Pacino didn't just imagine what it would be like. He sat across from it. He looked it in the eye. And he understood.